Millions of frontline workers keep our economy running and are provided with the latest technology to do their jobs. But digital adoption, especially by frontline workers, is really hard.
This is Frontline Innovators. We explore how to overcome challenges and achieve success when we empower our essential workers.
I'm Justin Lake.
And I'm Gene Signorini. Together, we speak with experts who are leading the way and driving digital transformation to the front line.
This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, on a mission to help frontline workers learn and use the technology needed to succeed in their jobs. Today's going to be a really great episode. Today's guest has been featured in Forbes and Huffington Post, considers herself very detail-oriented and well-organized, and is currently the manager, Gas Transformation Change Office at National Grid. Please welcome Shelby Matzell. Hello, Shelby.
Hi, Justin. Thank you for having me on today.
Thank you for joining. I'm really excited to have the conversation with you today. And we're going to start off, as we always do, with the question about deskless workers. What do you think is the biggest challenge you see facing the deskless workforce today?
So I would say the biggest challenge I see facing the deskless workers today is really around being able to reach them with communications. They, not being at a desk all day, they're not sitting there waiting for communications and reading them right as they come into their inbox. They have to oftentimes go and specifically find an email communication that they may be looking for that may have been referenced to them. So I would say one area where we do find trouble with communicating to the field force is just being able to reach them where they're at. And we've tried to work creatively and being able to communicate effectively with them about what any changes are, or just anything that they need to know for their work that they do. So we've tried a few different means of communication, but I would say that is one of the top things that I think we do have some trouble in just being able to effectively communicate with them about whatever it is that they may need to know.
Would you say that has changed at all for the better or worse throughout the pandemic over the last year and a half or so? Or would you say that was a challenge that existed even prior to March of 2020?
It definitely existed prior to March of 2020. I would say maybe it's gotten a little bit better now that people are so focused on, not being face-to-face and not being able to rely on in-person meetings and having to really find people with Zoom and Teams meetings and email communication. So I think it has maybe gotten a little bit better in that they do have to, look in other places to find communications and be able to get up to speed with what's going on, and just knowing that, maybe not everyone is in the office where in the past we all were. So I think it maybe has improved a bit, but still they're out in the field day after day, not really focused on communications that are coming into their inbox. So I still do find it to be a challenge.
Yeah. Okay, that's good. I want to come back and spend a little bit more time on that. But before we come back to that, I'd really like for me and the audience to get a chance to know you a little bit better. So I really like to dig in and want to really give you the option to decide how far you want to go back. But I mean, I'd really love to hear a little bit about, your schooling and kind of work us up through how you ended up in the role at National Grid that you have today.
Sure. Yes. So I started at National Grid right out of undergrad. So right after college, it was my first, real job outside of just an internship. And I started in the community and customer department working in our Rhode Island business, supporting a lot of our storm restoration efforts and meeting with town and city administrators to determine, what their priorities are in the event of an outage, things like that. So also working closely with our municipalities on our emergency preparedness. It was a really interesting role and an eye-opening role for me. And it's really a role that I actually reflect a lot back on often, because it really gave me the opportunity to work a lot with both, understanding internally the different departments that I relied on and worked with, but also externally as well, working with first responders, police and fire, and just aligning on messaging and what our first steps are in the event of an emergency. So it was a really great first role at the company, and I really loved that role. At the same time, so I majored in college in communications, and then I went to grad school while I was working for communication management. So I was really interested in getting closer to our communications department at the company. So I started seeking out opportunities within our more corporate sector of the company. So I did end up moving to corporate affairs. And I spent about 5 years in corporate affairs with a few different roles. Some of them being I wrote our internal communications for our leadership team. I wrote email communications that would go out to all of our employees. So kind of brings us back to that first initial question too around communicating. But additionally, I did some media as well. And I really also loved my time in communications. It was also very eye-opening to me. You know, I would be writing about all of these really amazing stories that people in the field were doing. And some of them I just couldn't believe that all this was happening under our same umbrella. You know, there's so much to the company that I couldn't really believe it. And I really wanted to learn more about what specifically our field force does. And that is what brought me to where I am today and the department that I'm in today of the Gas Transformation Office. So I started working on a program called Gas Business Enablement. And the purpose really of me moving to that program was because I was writing all these amazing stories about what the field was doing, but I never really felt very connected to it in that I really truly knew all that it entailed. So I really wanted to get closer to what I thought was really the heart of our business, and that is, to me, the field force. So that's when I made the move to Gas Business Enablement, started to learn more about what our field force does on a daily basis.
So it looks like you had a role that started in around 2018. That was the program manager of that group. Are you still in that group today? Is that the same group, just a new position, essentially?
It is. It is the same group. It's now under a different umbrella, really.
Okay.
So, yep.
Okay. But your responsibilities are largely the same as
Yes.
you were describing before.
Yes.
So it's interesting. Sometimes we've interviewed folks that when I look at their schooling as compared with the job they have today, it's like, okay, you're going to have to really explain, that point to point connection here. But in your case, your degree has communications in it. Almost every role, as I looked at your LinkedIn profile, has communications in it. When I asked you what you thought was the biggest problem facing the deskless workforce today, you said communications. So I'm starting to see a common thread here. And I really think that's what's made this change management series that we've been doing here on the podcast really so eye-opening to me, is that it's really communication is, at least from what I can tell from talking to the other professionals, really the key component to change. It's not necessarily about the mechanics as much as it is about the expectation setting and how we're communicating with those folks. So, I mean, just help us understand, how is your background in communication? Like, how is that changing how you choose to use communications as an enabling force for change?
It's a great question. I see communication as really a foundation of change, because if you go back to really what communication is about, and really the purpose of needing to know your audience, I think that is key for change management, because you do have to tailor your messaging depending on who the audience is for it to really resonate and be able to stick. Additionally, in communications, we know that repetition is key as well. We don't expect to go and deliver a message to our field force and then that be it, and have them fully understand that and be able to apply that. We need to have a plan and an approach to be able to talk with them multiple times before making a change, before expecting them to be able to execute on what that change is, or in my case, what the solution that they're receiving is. So I think that it really does come back to communications a lot of the time, and just being able to communicate effectively, keep everyone informed so that they have your trust, and just being able to keep those open lines of communication so that you can receive their feedback and better tailor the messaging to fit the needs of your audience.
In terms of feedback, I'm curious. So you believe, when I asked you about what you think is the biggest challenge facing the workforce, we talked about communication. I'd be curious, what do you think if you were to flip that around and we were to go ask some of the men and women that represent that deskless workforce in your organization, what would they say is their biggest challenge? Would they agree that it's communication, or is there some other way that maybe they would perceive the challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So I don't think that their first response would be communication. I think for them, it's actually a bit more tactical. I think they might mention something in their workspace or their field, like the office that they report to each day, as something that could be improved for them. I don't think that they do see the bigger picture of, we're not being communicated effectively. I don't think that would be their feedback. I do think it would be more focused on the work that they do
The
every day.
tools, the
Exactly.
trucks,
Yep.
the
The tools for
hours,
them.
the work order
Hmm.
management that we're dealing with, right? Some of the things like
Right.
that. Yeah. Well, one thing that some other folks have said, and I'd like to just get your take on it, is they feel that sometimes the deskless workforce feels like they're not being heard. And I'm curious, with your strength in communication, if you feel like there's some way perhaps to facilitate better communication from the field back to others. And you talked about feedback from them as one of those key things. You've already mentioned that. So any practices, best practices you can share in terms of how we can all do a better job of soliciting feedback, opening up the line of communications, not from corporate to the frontline workers, but in this case, the exact opposite of that, the reverse.
Right. So I would say if we could just take their feedback from any forum that we're able to get that from, whether it's a survey, live feedback, anything that they're requesting more info on, or just like we talked about, a tool, if it's a tool that they need refreshed, or just whatever it is that they're asking for. And if we have the ability to deliver that for them, doing the best we can to meet them where they need to be. Because I do think if we were able to take their feedback or their suggestions and deliver, then they would be more receptive to anything else that we bring to them in terms of communication, or in terms of what they need to know for their role, and being able to deliver that as well.
Yeah. I think that's really good. I've always been an advocate for getting out in the field. I've always been around organizations that have a disproportionate number of frontline workers, many of them very, remote, mobile workforces, and just getting outside to hear what they have to say, to see the environment that they work in. When we then come back and sit in a comfortable air-conditioned conference room, it just gives us so much better perspective about the things that we're building and the things that we're trying to implement with them. And so I do think it's encouraging on these podcasts to hear the amount of folks that have been talking about really opening up that communication. Sometimes that means being physically there. Sometimes, as you just described, it just means having a mechanism and really paying attention to the feedback. I mean, it's one thing, and I think this is really what you're saying, right? It's one thing to have the communication, but it's another to actually do something with it, to acknowledge it, to digest it, and to turn it back into something that's actionable. I feel like that's a big part of what you're really describing here.
Right. And one story that I heard as well, that stuck with me is, one of our leaders was out in the field, delivering communication, and doing a town hall type meeting with our field force. And at the end, they asked, does anyone have any questions, any feedback? Really trying to engage with them. And one gentleman, raised his hand, and he said, well, something that we could really use here is a picnic table to eat lunch outside. Like, just that really stuck with me because, it sounds and seems like such a small thing, but it's something that would make a big difference to them. And if we're able to, deliver on something like that, that would make their work environment more comfortable for them, to be able to sit together and collaborate and eat lunch together, then I think they would, return that and be more receptive to any messaging that we need to deliver to them and the work that they do.
That's fantastic. Well, you mentioned trust earlier too, and I think that's just opening up that line of communication, hearing things like that. Hopefully, the leader that was communicating took that feedback in a positive way. Maybe or maybe not. You were able to actually move forward with the picnic table, but just being able to accept that feedback and turn it into building a relationship with the men and women in the field, right? Rather than it just being like you said, emails going back and forth that don't really mean anything.
Right.
Yeah, that's really good. Well, I am curious, in an organization like yours, we touched on this a little bit about the impact of the pandemic and how it's changed. And I was asking you just a little bit about the change in communication since before and after. I'd like to just go back to that a little bit so we can, just dive a little deeper. What I've noticed, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, is that I think we've all become more open to video conferencing and to other forms of communications. Many companies have implemented Microsoft Teams, even all the way out to their frontline workers. So just curious about maybe some of the changes that you've seen and how that's actually impacted how you're handling your change strategies and tactics.
Absolutely. So 2020, I know, was a challenging year for the whole world. And it's our company was, no different. We also had a challenge ahead of us and had to quickly navigate that with our field force and all of our employees. One area in our change management, so we had a major release planned for April 2020. And of course, just given the state of the world, we had to shift our timing a bit with that, as we had all these planned trainings that were going to be in person. We had a whole plan for our post go live support. All of that was dependent on face to face. So we as a program had to quickly pivot and come up with a plan on how can we move forward, by still supporting our stakeholders best, still being able to deliver for our customers safely and effectively. But also, how do we deliver this release without having the option to be in person for training and in person for post go live support? So we did have to move toward a lot of virtual training, which before 2020, I don't think really would have been very acceptable for our program to make that decision. I think our field force being in the office and having to still come into the office throughout that COVID period, they still had to be there. So we as a program, where we had a lot of restrictions on how many people could be in a room together and what that would look like if people were face to face, we had to pivot and move toward a lot of virtual training sessions. So we did do that. But that being said, of course, we had to take into consideration that for the field force especially, they're not on Teams meetings or Zoom calls often. They're not necessarily familiar with how that even goes, of logging into a Zoom call, going on mute, coming off mute, raising your hand and to get the instructor's attention. So we actually held what we called our technology checks ahead of our training sessions, so that we could familiarize our field force with how to do all these things before they came into a training session, so that they're not navigating all that for the very first time right at training, when they have to spend a few hours learning this new solution. We wanted them to be able to join training fresh, with a fresh mind, to be able to absorb all of this information they're getting. So we set up those tech checks just ahead of our training sessions to really just help familiarize them with what that looks like.
I think that's the technology checks are a fantastic idea. And if you saw me smiling when you were talking about, training them on how to go off and on mute, there's a lot of corporate workers around the globe that have been doing video conferencing for years and still can't figure that problem out.
Oh yeah.
So
oh yeah, you hear that all the time.
I'm wondering if we should be instituting technology checks for all workers across an enterprise, not just for the men and women on the front line. So that's maybe a best practice we can take and deploy entirely. But I think that's actually a great example. And it speaks to a lot of what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is using technology as a way to deliver information about technology, right? And there are some potential hiccups there, right? Because if we're teaching people, how to use video conferencing so that we can now deliver training on how to use other software or implement other changes in the business, we're stacking a lot of changes together. And we do have to take into account that everybody isn't at the same baseline in terms of their understanding of using these tools. So I definitely think as a society, we've come far ahead. A lot more people are using FaceTime and getting more comfortable seeing their face on a video conference and all of that kind of stuff, and seeing their colleagues. But there is still some, kind of base level understanding that everybody has to have to be successful. And it's great to hear the way that you step back to cover that. I think that's awesome.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's really good. So we've improved communications. Are you using other technology other than things like Teams? Are there any other technologies that you have implemented, not for business purposes, but for the purposes of supporting change and communication? Are there any other nuggets that we can draw from there, of maybe other things that you guys have done?
So in terms of change management, we do have a few different channels to communicate with the field force and with all of our employees, really.
Yep.
So we do use email often, but we also use what we call Yammer, which is a channel where we can post updates and make things a little more personal. We can tag people in those. So Yammer is used across our organization for that. Additionally, we set up some Teams channels so that it's more of like a chat room rather than a video call, for instance. So there's a few different options that we use during post-go live support as ways to help people and a channel for them to ask questions or get the support that they need. We use what we call a hybrid approach now for training and post-go live support. So you have some people on site being able to help one-on-one and just be a resource to ask any questions to, as well as an open Teams line. So if you have a question throughout the day, you can just call right into the Teams line to ask your question or get the help and support that you need. We also provide some resources that are more self-guided. So our trainings, we record those so that we can send those out as people can reference, as well as what we call our quick reference guides and our ebooks. Our ebooks are really built of a bunch of quick reference guides it shows step-by-step of functionality with a screenshot on how to do pretty much all the functionality that they're getting. So those are able to just, resort back to and refer back to the QRGs with any questions that they have as well.
Yeah. All the things you just talked about are near and dear to my heart with, what we do in our business during the day. So I'm curious to hear, are there any tips that you can offer about, you talked about self-guided training in the forms of video content and things like that. What lessons have you and your team learned about kind of what works, what doesn't work, maybe things that you want to continue to do and those that you don't want to do again?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's been a journey. The program has been going on for a few years now. We're about to have our third major release. So of course we've built a lot of lessons learned into each release as we've gone. So I would say one of the first lessons learned that we were able to build into our second major release was just around the materials that we build and how we build them. So a lot of our materials initially, when we kicked off, were very PowerPoint focused and a lot of screenshots.
Yeah.
We quickly learned that, that might not be the best way to train our field force in a way that it resonates with them. So we have navigated more toward an approach that we call our tell it, show it, do it approach. And what that looks like is Yes, we still do have some slides to really, our Tell It section will talk through, an overview of what the change is, what this means for you and your teams and your role. And then we'll talk through the functionality and the solutions that they'll be receiving. The Show It section, our trainer will go into a live demo in our train environments and talk through step by step what they're doing, each click by click, and explaining the whole way through. And then that brings us to the third final section that we call our Do It section. And that is where we then hand some credentials over to our learners for them to log into the train environment themselves and walk through some scenarios that were pre-built, built with their help as well. So they would be real live scenarios, something that what they might run into on a daily basis, that they should be familiar with, and using that to then walk through that functionality that they were just taught, so that they know how to apply what they're learning to what their role is today. So we use our train environment for all of that, so that they can click through without having to, feel like they're going to mess up any data. It's all just dummy data that's in there, so they can feel free to just click through and really get hands-on and ask any questions that they have along the way.
That's amazing. It sounds like you guys really put a lot of thought and probably a lot of work into making that learning experience, very solid for the user.
Yes, we have put a lot of thought and work into just the training approach, as well as all that goes into it too, with the environments and the data and all of that.
Any disadvantages that you can think of to the approach that you just described for us?
I would say something that we continuously work through is just making sure our training environments are in a good place. Our training
How do you describe that? Yeah. How would you describe it being in a good place?
So we want to make sure that the data is loaded in there so that it looks reflective of real data. So I know I said it is dummy data, so it's all fake data, but we want it to be reflective of what they, or as close as we can to what they will see once we go live. So some things that are there, having actual names for our technicians, like not their actual names, but
right.
Like what a name would look like instead of just jumbled letters. Making sure that the cities and towns that we are using are actual cities and towns in the areas where we live and work and the communities that we serve. Just trying to really make the environments as reflective of the real environments as we can, so that once we go live, they will get into the solutions and it should feel familiar to them. Like it's not the first time that they're in these solutions. They should have felt that, okay, I've done this before. I've been through this piece of functionality. I remember this. So
what kind of feedback do you get from the users on this approach?
We've gotten some really good feedback, especially on the Do It section.
Yeah.
They really want to get hands-on. I would think if we could, they would want it to be fully hands-on, the whole training class, which we do try to make that a heavy focus of it, but we also still want to talk through, the Tell It section of making sure they understand the big picture and where all of the solutions fit into their roles, and also dependencies of theirs and how that all works. So we do still stick to the Tell It, Show It, Do It, but they really appreciate the emphasis on the Do It. They want to get hands-on. They want to get hands-on as soon as they can. And the instructor-led training, which is what I'm talking through now with the Tell It, Show It, Do It, it is not the first time that they're hearing from us or seeing the solutions. We have about a 3 to 4 month engagement plan ahead of them even coming into the classroom, so that we can start what we call drip feed learning and just delivering them small pieces of information over a course of time, so that they understand what the program is and why it's happening, as well as then getting into the change. So what the change impact assessment tells us, that they're moving from this to this, and they're going to be using these solutions in the future for these capabilities, and starting to really communicate that with them and showing them some demos, some modules that just walk them through a quick demo, or some gamification around terminology, what some vocabulary that they use today might look like in the future. So going into training, they should already be familiar with the solutions that they're going to be trained on.
So something that you said, it sounds so obvious, and I don't say that to diminish the value of your comment. In fact, it's quite the opposite. When you talk about communicating in advance, and you talked about having a 3 to 4 month communication plan prior to even actually going down this path. I mean, of course, it sounds so obvious when you say it, and yet we see it actually happen very rarely, right? And it seems like it would be such a relatively easy thing to implement that doesn't cost a fortune, but to start setting expectations early and often, way ahead of when that change is actually taking place. Because I've come to realize, through this process, that it's the technology can be very intimidating for a lot of the men and women on the front line. And if we drop a bomb on them in the last minute and they've already got 20 other work orders that they've got to get done this week or this day or whatever the case, like they've already got their other workload to handle. And now we're dropping this change on them with very little notice. I am guilty of this. I don't adapt to change very well with short notice. So why would we expect anyone else in the organization to do that too? So I know that's probably not the most complicated part of your change plan, but it's actually probably one of the most meaningful things to really begin to have a positive impact from the first time you start communicating with that.
Right. Yeah.
So when you talk about the drip feed learning, is that essentially kind of one and the same with the 3 to 4 month communication plan? Is that what you're saying? And what tools are you using for that? Is that literally just emails or putting up signs in break rooms and things like that? Like what methods are you using for that?
Yeah, so it is. So the drip feed learning portion of the program is that like 3 to 4 months ahead of training, just beginning to upskill them on what's changing. And depending on which work stream, so which area we're talking about, and we have really navigated our drip feed learning plans to specific work streams. So we have them broken out in different areas, but what that looks like for some, just to talk through a few examples of what that is. So we will have supervisor upskilling sessions where we'll meet with supervisors, dependent on the work stream, weekly, bi-weekly, to walk them through functionality and really make sure that they're feeling confident about what the change is and being able to communicate with their teams effectively and answer questions for their teams. We really want the supervisors to really play a big role in making sure their teams feel comfortable and that they are able to lead by example there and knowing the solutions really well ahead of training. Additionally, we do use email for some drip feed communications. So we'll send out a module that will ask the learners to log in and just walk through some gamification that we'll set up for them. So we might have kind of like matching tiles where you flip a tile over and it's a word and you have to match it to, what that word might mean as far as functionality and the solution. Additionally, some other means of drip feed learning will be in person. We'll go in person and do some info sessions, some just introductions to the program, what's changing. We'll bring iPads in and be able to get them hands-on with the iPads, learning about iPad functionality. We try not to assume that everyone has a device, an iPhone or an iPad already. So we'll cover, how to navigate an iPhone with them. We'll use that as part of drip feed learning so that in training, they're comfortable already with their devices that they're getting. So we do, we build out our plan for drip feed learning and we do tailor it to the work stream depending on where they're at.
With all the things that you just said, wrapping up with the part about learning about iPad functionality, we've often said, hands-on workers benefit from hands-on training. And what we mean by that is that many frontline workers are optimized for learning by doing. And that's probably true of all humans, right? We know the learning pyramid and, we all certainly have benefits, but these folks in particular, you can't learn how to hook up a gas meter or an electric transformer just through e-learning. At some point, you really need to do those kinds of things, right? So to have that hands-on experience and to interact with the real world seems to be such a powerful learning methodology. And you've just talked about that as a series of great examples here and how you're implementing that in your routine. That's fantastic.
Great.
What are some of the lessons learned maybe from all that you just described? This sounds like a very, very comprehensive plan. So I commend you guys on how thoughtful you've been about putting all this plan in place. Are there any other lessons learned that you can share with us of maybe things that you want to tweak going forward?
So one lesson learned that we learned at our last major release is the need for continuous learning. So we have this drip feed learning phase, and then we go into instructor-led training, and then we go live, and we have a full post-go live support model as well. But we're also learning that we need to also embed some continuous learning into our post-go live support structure. So if we think about the field force and the different work streams that we're going live with, not everything, or maybe not everything, needs to be applied on day one, week one, month one. If there are smaller pieces of the process or of functionality that they may use sometimes, but isn't critical to their role, and it's really more of like a good to know than a need to know, then maybe that's something that we pull out of training and we instead embed that into our continuous learning and post-go live support area, because they are learning so much right up front. And we really want to drive home what they need to know for day one, week one, month one for their role. And then anything that, they might not need to know, but is helpful or good to know, or just a best practice, we can continue building on that. And we can continue the relationship and the ongoing communication with them and build that into a plan for once they're already live and familiar with the solutions and feeling comfortable with the new tools that they received, then we can build upon that.
That's a absolutely fantastic answer. And it speaks to, there are a handful of things that I've learned from talking with the change management professionals we've had on the podcast. Obviously, communication is a heavy part of that, but the other big thing that stands out in my mind is change saturation. How much change we're subjecting all of the people to involved in this. And you just brought that down to kind of a micro level, right? Which is to say, even just within this program, within the training within this program, do we need, if there's 75 different transaction types that these folks need to learn over time, do they need to learn all 75 transactions now? Or can we just bring that down to the 30 that everybody's going to need to use every day right out of the gate and then build on that? And I absolutely love that example. A lot of times what we've talked about is, there's folks that have implemented all 75, and just in my hypothetical example here, implemented 75, and then there's some sort of plan later to recover when people have forgotten some of those steps. But I like the way that you're actually reducing the scope of the initial training first. And I think what that would do for the people, excuse me, is really build on their success rather than put them into a situation where they're struggling or failing with those other transactions, right? So you can allow them to be successful, encourage them, help them be successful right out of the gate, and then continue to build on those proficiencies over time. I think that's really an amazing approach.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Okay.
This is a little bit, so another thing that I've learned from change management professionals over the last 10 or 15 episodes now is many of you are put into a position where you have to evangelize the need for and the value of a change management strategy. Different organizations seem to be embracing this, that they are at a different level in their evolution about how much they're embracing this as a strategy. I'm curious if there is something or a few things that you wish leadership, generally, not asking you to point out people inside your company necessarily, but what do you think leadership, generally speaking, needs to understand more about change management that they're maybe not thinking of completely today?
So I really do think that our leadership has a great sense of change management and the need for it, especially in our field. The purpose of our program came from our senior leadership, because they were walking around the field and noticed the struggles that people were having with the technology and the tools that they had today. Our company is built from several legacy companies who all kept their their legacy processes and their legacy tools. So as a company, we had just so many different solutions that people were using, and each jurisdiction had a different way of doing things. So across the board, though, we were finding that they're struggling. The tools are taking too long to start up. They don't talk with one another. Some tools didn't have the ability to get updated. So you kind of just had to go with the flow, whatever it was today. So in doing some site visits, our leadership really determined we need to update our tools and solutions so that, one, we work as one team and one company, and we all can, push toward the same goal of delivering safely and effectively for our customers. And additionally, I would say they saw the need for really enabling our field force to be able to use tools and have access to data quickly, and just being able to, safely work and be out in the field and know that the tools that they had were going to set them up for success. So I think that the change approach really did come from leadership to say, our field force is working really hard every day, delivering for our customers, daytime, nighttime, and all the crazy weather that we have. And let's really work toward getting them into a place where they're able to use these tools and solutions that work for them, as well as taking the opportunity to align our company on the same solutions. And so that we can also have similar processes in the different jurisdictions where we work and the communities that we serve.
And that's fantastic. I mean, it says a lot about your team and about the leadership in your organization and the corporate culture that you have. I can tell you, just as a personal experience, as we've been reaching out to guests that kind of fit the profile that you fit. We've targeted companies in a series of industries where we know they have a disproportionate number of frontline workers and things like that. And it's really amazing if you just do a search in LinkedIn for those companies and then change management for keywords. It's really mind-boggling to see the difference between certain companies in an industry versus their peers in the exact same industry, and how some may have 20, 30, 100 people that have change management in their title, and others may have none. And that's been a really fascinating observation. I think, just as we've been kind of learning more about your role in the profession, to see that some companies are very invested in this and understand that this is a true differentiator. It deals with, talent development. It deals with just operational effectiveness. It deals with all of those things together. And then yet other organizations seem to be making a very little, if any, investment in that area. And so your company sounds like to really be a standout, obviously on the good end of that scale. So that's, it's really exciting to hear you talk about it. And I could just see your body language as you're talking through the story. You have a sense of pride about working in the organization that you do and being in the role that you're in. And that's got to feel good for you. And I can only imagine that the frontline workers that are impacted by probably all the employees, but I'm asking about the frontline employees, how they all really get to benefit from your company's top-down approach in that, and then the great effort that you and your team are putting in. That's pretty neat stuff.
Great. Thank you.
So we're blowing through time here. I figured this was going to happen. It always seems to go. This 45 minutes just goes so fast in this call. But I'd really love to get your take on what you really love most about working in technology and around technology and digital transformation initiatives.
So I really love working with the people that I do work with. The field, like I saw before I even worked so closely with them, I saw all the work that they were doing, and was just blown away by how much is going on in the field and all the projects that they're doing, and also the response that they have, and just being able to respond to the communities that they serve quickly and safely. I've just really loved working with the people. And I would say one of the biggest takeaways for me and our program as a whole really has been our partnership with not just the business, but also our union workforce. That has been huge, and being able to work closely with them from the very start at the program, and keeping keeping them informed, but also making it a real partnership where they're able to give us a few resources to work more closely with. We call them our enhanced user network, which is made up of some management and some union employees. And we're able to work really closely with them, upskill them, but also they give us their feedback on, maybe if we come up with a scenario and they say that wouldn't actually happen in the field, like we don't do that every day. It's so good to know that up front before we head into drip feed learning and training. So we learn so much from them, and we're able to work really closely with them. We show them the training materials ahead of going into training so that they can provide us feedback. They attend our training dry runs with us so that they can, if the instructor is using any terminology that maybe they wouldn't use, they would call something different, they're able to provide that feedback ahead of training so that once we get into training, all of our learners are more enabled to have the message resonate with them and be able to learn the solutions rather than getting hung up on just terminology or a process that may have been incomplete if we didn't have our enhanced user network right there with us to help us through the learner journey.
What words matter, right? And
they do.
So we've talked about this a lot in terms of both training and prototyping solutions and exposing them for feedback. And, when you're in that prototyping phase, whether it's learning content or whether it's actually a new piece of technology, and you have some things that you've just kind of glossed over. Hey, we just need to put a placeholder there. It doesn't really matter that it's accurate because we know as the technology team or the training, learning and development team that you're just putting it there as a placeholder. But man, that makes people it makes their heads pop off their shoulders, right? They cannot look at that prototype and not see the mistakes, right? They just can't look past it for the purposes of the communication, right? So I think it's great that you get that feedback. You refer to that as an enhanced user group. Did I get that right?
Enhanced user network.
User network. Okay. And would you essentially say that that's the same as what other folks might call like a change champion network? Is it essentially the same kind of thing? I mean, it sounds very similar, but maybe not being used for the exact same purpose.
Yeah, it sounds very similar. I think it probably would be quite the same. It's just a group that we're able to work really closely with for the few months ahead of training, and just making sure that everything as we're laying it out makes sense for them and their role and what their teams will experience. And then we also lean on our enhanced user network as well in post go live to help us deliver those messaging. So going back to communications, we're able to, have a few people who we can communicate with and know that they'll help spread the word to their peers and their teammates. And also helping to close out any questions or just any concerns that their teams may have.
Yeah, that's good. I feel like your dog may have had some input on that too. Do we need to collect his or her thoughts on that question about working in technology, or should we just move on? I
think so.
Okay.
We can just move on.
I've got one last question for you, and that is kind of the opposite side of that. So what you love about working in technology actually has nothing to do with the technology, but it had to do with the people. What do you dislike about it? What do you not like about working with technology?
It's been a journey for me working with technology. I've learned that, you can't aim for perfection in technology, especially with like digital technology and solutions that we're deploying. I've learned they're never going to be perfect. Once we go live, of course, we find defects, and we build those into what we call our dot releases, where we can make fixes to any defects and also make enhancements for feedback that we've gotten from the business of things that need to be updated. But that's been a challenge for me, is to know that, it's not going to be perfect. And what we're going to be delivering is fit for the business, and it suits the needs of the business. But it's difficult to not be able to aim for perfection. But I think that's been a challenge for me personally in just starting to work with technology and getting into solutions.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And, I've been one of those technology providers for a long time that's been building and deploying those solutions. And it is never perfect. And I think a lot of that really comes down to setting expectations. And actually, some of the other folks that we've interviewed here on the podcast have mentioned a variation of this, that they've come to realize they need that to actually be a part of the communication plan with the receivers of this technology, is to say, listen, I know we're talking about this go live date of November 1st. It's not going to be perfect on November 1st, right? Let's just say that here. So here's the plan. When you do encounter something that doesn't work right, here's how you communicate with us, and here's how we'll communicate back, right? And so just incorporating that into the change plan, to accept the reality that, yeah, we're going to uncover things on day one and for the first few weeks or months of this deployment, but we've got to have a communication plan. And if we set the expectation that everything's just going to be honky-dory, we're going to, fall on our face, and it's not going to be good for everybody. So it is interesting to hear you talk about that. And that is generally a frustration that what we do during the planning phase. The goal is to get to this ideal state of perfection, like you said, but it very rarely happens.
Right. And I think you said it correctly too, like just setting the right expectation goes a long way, and just making sure that you're transparent as a partner, and you're going to deliver all the news that you have for them, and what the solution will look like for day one is really important.
Yeah, it's good stuff. All right. We do need to wrap it up there. I do want to invite you now to participate. We just recently launched the Frontline Innovators Council, which is a private group that we have set up in LinkedIn with other peers that are doing very similar things across a variety of other industries, although we do have a bunch of other folks that are coming from utilities in the group. And so for kind of suffering through with a 45-minute podcast interview with me, that is your fee for entry into the council. And so today you'll get an invitation to participate in that group. Absolutely can't wait to have you as part of the group, and have you sharing and learning from all the other folks there. So welcome to that. And thank you very much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you very much, Justin. This was great. I appreciate it.
Well, hope the audience has found this conversation as enjoyable as I have. If so, please share and rate the podcast. 5-star ratings help ensure that it gets promoted to other professionals like you that are innovating on the front lines. This podcast is sponsored by Skillful, the mobile digital adoption platform for deskless and frontline workers. Visit the website at skillful.com. That's SKYLLFUL.com. And if you or someone else is out there innovating on the front lines, we'd love to hear about it. Please reach out to me on LinkedIn and share your story, and we'll see you on our next episode. Thank you so much for today.